All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm showing that we are at 9 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and begin. We've got Dr. Will Hudson here, who is an extension entomologist, and he's going to talk to us about um, trending topics in urban forestry and give us a general update about stuff that's going on. So, Dr. Hudson, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
All right, thanks, Heather. Again, for everyone else, I am fighting a cough here, so I'll probably be sucking on a cough drop most of the time. Hopefully my voice will hold out. I think the biggest issue that we have in urban forestry right now is the drought effects on some of our trees and landscapes. We have seen this repeatedly over the years here. It seems like perhaps the cycles are getting worse. A very long, hot summer in all of Georgia. I know we set a record up here in North Georgia for a number of 90-degree days, for the hottest September on record, et cetera, et cetera. We started off really, really wet and then turned off pretty much bone dry. So even though officially we might look at only being 4 or 5 inches below normal in rainfall, that distribution pattern actually makes it much worse than it might appear. And the reason for that is the trees coming out of the winter and spring, the soil was saturated, and so they weren't growing any roots except right at the very surface. And then when it suddenly became bone dry, they didn't have the root structure down deeper in the soil profile that would help them support themselves and keep themselves healthy. And as we know from any orchard crop where you're planting a tree, the first thing you've got to do is be able to supply water, or else you really aren't going to be able to manage the crop, because water is the critical thing for trees. It's what keeps the plains from being a forest out in the American Midwest, is because they don't get enough rain and they don't get it in the right patterns that would allow trees to thrive. So the sort of double whammy of a very, very wet winter and spring that reduced the root system for anything that was down much below the surface, and then a really, really hot and dry summer has put a lot of stress on a lot of our trees. Even some very big, mature, long-lived trees, the oaks and other things in our landscapes are under some pressure. And when you look at insect attacks, the most devastating ones are the wood-boring beetles, bark beetles, ambrosia beetles, all of those. And the tree's first line of defense is sap. So as soon as a beetle starts to bore into the tree, that tree will immediately try to push the beetle back out with the pressure of the sap in the tree. And if there's not enough water coming into the root system, then the turgor pressure up in the tree and the bark is not high enough to allow it to successfully eject that attacker. And that can lead to a vulnerability that you wouldn't ordinarily expect in otherwise healthy trees. And that can happen over a relatively short term. So the question I always get is, well, what can we do to protect our trees? And the bottom line is there's not an insecticidal solution in most cases. You need to water those trees, basically, and watering a very large tree is not a casual operation. So you have to think ahead. It's hard to catch up once they are very dry and drought stressed. We see this all the time in our pecan orchards. If it's very dry in August, then the pecan weevils can't get out of the ground. They're more or less entombed in concrete down there when the ground is really dry. But if you're talking about a weevil that's 4 or 5 inches down in the ground, a really heavy thunderstorm one afternoon is not going to soak the ground far enough down to soften it up. it takes an extended rain. An all-day soaker like we had on Saturday is a pretty good one. But even there, if you go out in the yard where you've been really, really dry and start digging, you'll find that it's not really moist, very much below an inch or two below the surface. So that's the amount of rainfall, and the timing of rainfall is what's critical to the trees in our landscape. And I expect that we will see some trees failing. And it's no one likes to see a tree die, and particularly you don't want to see that sort of specimen tree that you built your house behind specifically because it was there. You don't want to see that tree die. But most of the time when you get a call and then you call me, it's way too late to do much for that tree. Once if it's a pine tree, once the needles turn brown, there's not much that you can do to allow that tree to recover. It's pretty well gone. So you always have wood-boring beetles, and particularly you always have ambrosia beetles and things like that in dead and dying trees. These bugs are all scavengers, and they're really good scavengers. So that's how they make their living. And they will be at that tree as soon as they detect a level of stress that makes them think they can be successful in attacking it.
Dr. Hudson, I've
Yes.
had a couple of calls from clients, speaking of specimen trees, who have they've been calling in because they've seen a lot of lichen on these drought stressed trees. Is there any correlation between the dryness, the heat, and the lichen, or are they just noticing this because the leaves got crispy and started falling off?
Well, if trees are growing actively, rapidly, then lichens don't really have much chance to get a hold on the bark. But the bigger the tree, the older the tree, then the less physical expansion of bark in any one place there is. You know, once a tree gets pretty well mature, then there's a lot of growth in the canopy, but those big limbs are not growing as fast. So lichens on the tree are not an unusual thing, and they're not necessarily a symptom of ill health or impending disaster, unless it's a small tree. If you've got a small tree that's growing slowly enough that you get a lot of lichen growth, then that's cause for concern.
Yeah, one was a Japanese maple, so pretty slow growing.
Right, and those trees, if they especially, I mean, that's an understory tree, so the right place to put it would be in a relatively shady area. And shade and moisture and slow growing trees mean you're going to have some lichens growing even out on the scaffold limbs and on the relatively small twigs. Not necessarily a problem.
All right, good morning and welcome everyone. We're having an informal chat here today. So if you've got questions for Dr. Hudson, please chime in. And once again, please put your name in the chat box so I can capture you for attendance.
Well, Heather, one thing I'd be interested in knowing is how many of your agents there have seen much in the way of ambrosia beetle problems this past year. We usually think of that as a springtime problem, and it generally is, but with drought stress, you can sometimes see successful attacks even well into the summer. The beetles are around all the time, so they are opportunistic, and they might well have attacked trees anytime this year.
We had some issues early on in the spring. I haven't had much report of them lately, though.
Well, it's an interesting pattern to watch, and we can't explain it, which is why we're just watching it. We had a really bad outbreak of ambrosia beetles about 7 or now 8 years ago. And it took 3 or 4 years for things to return to normal, which is where they're an occasional problem, and you can usually see the stress factor, at least in a landscape tree. In nurseries, that's a different story, but we went from losing probably 25% of the newly planted pecan trees that year down to just losing an occasional one this past year. Now, part of that is we didn't have near as many new trees put in, but the other part is that there just weren't as many beetles around. And I anticipate that after that really wet winter and spring going into the summertime this past year, that we may well see an increase in ambrosia beetle activity next spring, but that's my guess. We don't really have anything to go on except that seems to be a general pattern. After a really, really wet year, you have much better success with ambrosia beetles, so there's a lot more of them to fly around the next spring.
I think in the past you've also said that after a drought we may see more of the pine beetles as well.
Pines are particularly vulnerable to drought stress because that's what, you know, they're really good at protecting themselves if they're healthy and in a good site. But drought stress drops the turgor pressure, and bark beetles have a tendency to attack in numbers. They have pheromones that allow them to recruit other attackers once they find it's a vulnerable host, and they can just overwhelm a tree in a hurry if that tree is a little bit weakened. And once they're in, then some of them carry blue stain fungus that will kill the tree regardless of how many get in, and others it's just overwhelmed with numbers and destruction of the inner bark that causes death of the tree. And of course, once they start to go downhill because of bark beetles, then you get a lot of other scavenger beetles showing up. And so you can have a real variety in there after a month or so. Most of them are not primary attackers and didn't have anything to do with death of the tree.
So Dr. Hudson, you said our #1 issue is the drought right now. What about #2? Are we seeing any advance on some of these invasive insects that have come in, like the ash borer, emerald ash borer?
The emerald ash borer has been increasing, but not as fast as we were afraid it might. And part of that is just there are fewer ash trees in our forest than there are further north, where it really has swept through in a just a disastrous sort of invasive front up in Ohio and Michigan and places like that. We have not seen as many foliage-feeding caterpillars the last couple of years, particularly in urban settings. Webworms were not as bad this year as they were last year, but there were still plenty of them in spots. It was just much more likely to be hit or miss, I guess, even up in the mountains where they're more or less concentrated along the roads, and it's really easy to see where they are. The trees, except for drought, have not had all that much in the way of insect issues, at least. And this year, or really last year, except for a few exceptions.
I've got a question in the chat box from Greg Bowman. He says, I remember when we had a drought years ago, we had a UGA drought website with tips for a lot of areas. Many folks would call saying they could not lose huge oaks in their landscape and would want to water them. There was a formula of maybe measuring the trunk diameter and then giving maybe 20 to 25 gallons of water per inch of trunk diameter weekly. It could be hundreds of gallons water per tree. I know you would have to account for runoff, but does that sound about right?
It is about right, particularly for a very large tree. I remember when I was in school and taking a general ecology course, one of the exercises we did was look at how much evaporation there is off the surface of a pond, and then put a tree right next to the pond with roots that go down and draw water out of the pond, and see how much water you lose from transpiration in the canopy of the tree. And a single tree can suck out more water than you would have pan evaporation over the entire acre or so of pond around it. So they do use a lot of water. They use it obviously to maintain growth and photosynthesis and vigorous health, but they also use it as a cooling mechanism to release water vapor through the stomates in the leaves. And the demands for a tree are way more than you would really think. And that's why it's so hard to catch up if you let them get too dry. And it's also why it's such a challenge in most of our urban areas, because I know around here in Athens, you know, there's a step cost program in effect. So the first level of water that's what they consider to be household use is one price. But then when you get over that, the price jumps up pretty good. And then if you get up to the next step, it's really expensive. So if you're watering with city water anywhere, I would guess in Metro Atlanta, but certainly even in other smaller cities around North Georgia, it's cost prohibitive to try to water. And yes, hundreds of gallons of water per tree. If it's a mature tree, that's completely accurate. I think Lenny Wells, and I keep going back to pecans because we've got good data there, for young pecan trees that aren't really bearing but are just growing in, he's recommended 100 gallons of water per tree per week for small trees that are just getting started. So that's a lot of water. Usually they're planted in sandy areas, but still, that's a lot of water.
So you mentioned before we got started that you were down in South Georgia earlier or last week. Have you had a chance to visit any of the pecan groves that got devastated? And can you give us an update on what's going on down there?
Well, there were some that weren't just devastated, they were destroyed. There's one pretty good sized grower down there. He and his brother had about 750 acres of pecans, mature groves that they were managing, and his estimate was he had 750 trees left after the storm. So that's 90%, 95% loss of the trees. And if that pecan orchard was your main income, then you not only lost all of that, you also are going to be 10 to 15 years in trying to begin to get some income back if you plant pecans back. And that's where insurance falls short, because the value of any single pecan tree, they figure based on how many nuts it's going to produce that year. And it's 100 pounds of nuts, that's $200 or $250 a tree. And that really won't cut it for 15 years that you're out of income. So they're struggling to figure out what they need to do. Some other orchards were less severely damaged, and there were some. There's one pretty good sized grower in Middle Georgia that said, he lost about 11 or 1,200 trees. That's a lot of trees, but he has 1,100 acres. So if you're talking about an average of one tree per acre, that loss is much easier to cover, I guess, with income from what's left over. So it varied pretty widely, but if you were in extreme southwest Georgia, it was devastating. And that extends to forest trees as well. There are a lot of pine plantations down there. Pine trees are a major crop, and they were hit just as hard as the pecan orchards were in certain spots. So, they're estimating billions of dollars in tree loss down there.
I know there was a really optimistic article about replanting with some of the newer cultivars that'll be more disease resistant. But like you said, it'll be 10 years before they're up to production. Do you think that there's going to be any interest in doing that, coming in with the newer cultivars?
Well, some people, replanting has already started. There are options that people have. If you're a cotton farmer and your cotton crop gets blown away, then you just go in and plow the stubble in and replant next spring. It's a little more involved in the decision making for pecans. But one really common practice there is to, plant the young trees at a pretty close or higher density per acre, and let them grow up and then move them after 5 to 7 or 8 years. So that way, if you had 100 acres, you could plant trees on 50 acres and some cash crop on the other 50 to get you through, and then move them out some years later when they're closer to being productive in terms of producing a crop that you can harvest and sell. But it's a struggle, and it's a real decision that people have to make. There is a silver lining. A lot of those orchards, especially in Southwest Georgia, were really old. I mean, some of them were 100 years old. Trees that big are very difficult to manage, and the cultivars were older ones that were not as disease resistant and not as desirable in terms of the nuts that they produced. But people were reluctant to cut old trees down and plant new trees in their place. Well, now they don't have a choice. The trees are gone. They're going to have to plant new trees or do something else with the land. Fortunately, in Southwest Georgia, there's not a lot of pressure to develop that land into something other than farmland. So I expect the majority of them will go back into pecan.
Now, moving back to the urban environment, we've got a question from Dominique. Do you think that in urban areas using gray water systems or rain barrels would be better for water conservation? Would that be as efficient as using just straight municipal water?
Well, to the extent that you can collect rainwater, rain barrel systems are excellent. It does allow you to store up the water and then dispense it, in between rain events. And I have a very large elm tree right next to my house that is what the guy that was there before me did. He had a rain barrel right there by the side of the house that would collect. It probably collected 500 gallons of water, and then he could turn it on and with a soaker hose could water that very large elm tree, which was a specimen tree and really made a big difference in terms of shading the house and making the site look attractive. And that's a pretty good idea. But if you go into 6 or 8 weeks of drought, then you're going to run out of that water. Gray water is more constant, at least, because most people, if you're able to divert gray water into an irrigation system, then you more or less produce the same amount of gray water in your house over time, whether it's raining or not outside. So if you're able to rework your plumbing system, I guess is the right way to look at it, so that you can use that gray water, that's a good choice for landscape plants. It is water you've already paid for, so that's probably the biggest difference. You're not sinking hundreds of dollars into watering your trees. You're just reusing the water that you've already paid for.
If you're just joining us, welcome, and we're having an informal chat here with Dr. Hudson, so if you've got questions, please bring them on. One thing that we've been getting a lot of calls about is the Joro spiders. I spoke to a fellow yesterday who said he first reported seeing one in 2015, and I know that Dr. Hoback was taking data on that. Do you know if he's still doing that? This guy was saying he saw one 4 years ago, and he just took a walk in the woods, and they were everywhere.
It's coincidentally, I saw them in my yard this past weekend and emailed Rick and told him, sent him a picture, and he is still collecting data on where they are. They're really attractive spiders. They're pretty. They are a close relative of the big golden orb weaver that is native here, Nephiloclabopes. These are a different species in that same genus. They don't get quite as big, but they're really gaudy kind of spiders. I think that they are very well established over in this part of the state, in the several counties around Athens for sure. But that's probably just because that's where we are. And so there are a lot of entomologists around here that notice a different looking spider. Others might not. But yes, if you see a Joro spider, you should shoot Rick Hoback an email and give him your address so that he can confirm it on his map of where the Joro spiders are. As far as their impact on everything else, spiders, they're not really competitors with each other, except that if there's a shortage of other bugs for them to eat, then they're competing then. But that's usually not a problem in our South Georgia or Georgia landscapes anywhere. I see that Wade wants to discuss management of San Jose scale on apples. It's not just San Jose on apples. We have a lot of problems with scale insects on virtually any woody plant that you can imagine that you might have in your landscape. And I would point out that those sprays that are aimed at mosquito control in your home landscape are devastating to the natural enemies of all of our scale insects. And I think that's contributing in a major way to the increase in scale problems that we have in our shrubbery. And the problem is, particularly for armored scales, they can be pretty cryptic, and you don't realize you have a problem until the tree or the shrub starts to die back. And then when you go and look, you realize that there is a problem there. It's almost like the drought stress situation, in that by the time you notice that the plant is declining, then the damage is pretty severe. And it may take drastic pruning and lots of management to try to bring those trees or those shrubs back. In the landscape, urban environment, sort of, if you're talking about a deciduous tree, then the best time to treat for those scales is in the dormant season, when there aren't any leaves in the way, so you can get your oil or a pesticide, whatever you're spraying, to the scales themselves. But that sort of sets up the real problem, which is if the tree's any size at all, it's almost impossible to actually treat it. Our systemic insecticides, which are mostly neonicotinoids, are not very effective on armored scales for the most part, except for safari. And even then, if you've got scales on the bark, either on the main trunk or the scaffold limbs or even the small twigs, timing is critical. So you need to know what scale you've got and when they're going to be actively hatching out and moving out onto the new sites to feed, and time your application for that. And that's tricky because it takes a little while for most of those materials to get up in the tree. So you have to backdate a little bit and anticipate by a week or so when the real peak of that emergence is going to be. So San Jose scale on apples, apple trees are generally pretty small. You can usually spray them fairly effectively, at least when the leaves aren't on there. Use a horticultural oil at about 2%. I would do it in the fall, right after the leaves fall off, and again in the spring, just before the buds break. You don't have much danger of phytotoxicity at that point. The apples tolerate it pretty well, and if you stay at 2%, not dormant oil, but horticultural oil, one of the newer, more so-called ultrafine or faster moving, I guess, I don't know, there's several different terms that are used. But if you stick with horticultural oil rather than dormant oil, you can get pretty good control. And then another thing that works well are insect growth regulators, in particular the product called Distance is pretty good on armored scales and can make a big difference. But you're looking at 2 applications in the dormant season plus the Distance during the growing season when the crawlers are moving out and settling. And you're probably going to have to do that at least 2 winters in a row to get control of a scale population that's breaking out. So it takes commitment. I know that everybody wants to be mosquito-free. It's completely understandable why you wouldn't want to not only be annoyed by mosquitoes, but you don't want to be exposed to West Nile virus or Zika virus or Eastern equine encephalitis or any of those other things. But there's no free lunch, and mosquitoes can be difficult to kill. Almost always those foggers or sprays are using one of the pyrethroids, and they will definitely disrupt the natural control and kill lady beetles and lacewings and parasitic wasps in your landscape. So that's the price you pay to be 100% safe from mosquitoes.
I've put Rick Hobeck's email address in the chat box, so if you see the Joro spiders or have someone who's calling about them, you can give that information to him. Anyone else have questions, please chime in. Dr. Hudson, anything that homeowners should be looking out for as the season progresses?
Well, we're well into the fall now, so all those deciduous trees in the landscape are going to drop their leaves just as they would any year. What we will see next year, I'm afraid, particularly in some of these really seriously drought-stressed trees, is they'll leaf out in the spring and everything will look fine, and then the first really hot, dry spell in the early summer, all the leaves will fall off and the tree will be dead. It takes a while for a big tree to actually die. But once they start down that path, it's very difficult to reverse the course. So you need to be prepared for that, particularly when people begin to call and want to spray for wood-boring insects. You can't keep wood borers out of a dying tree. That's their whole reason for living, is finding those trees. So they're really good scavengers. Most of them are not anywhere near primary attackers. They won't really have much impact on a healthy tree. But it's important to keep the health of those trees in mind and give them whatever they need. Ordinarily, we come out of the winter with pretty good soil moisture. We've had very few years, particularly in North Georgia, where we didn't look pretty good, at least up until the middle of June, and then it starts to dry out. So if you've got a tree that's in drought stress now, do not let it get drought stress going into the summer next year if you can avoid it. Avoiding it can be a challenge, certainly. But you need also to recognize that sometimes you can't really tell what the problem is with a tree. We have a lot of rocks underground. Some of them are 6 feet underground and some of them are 6 inches underground. And until you go out there and scrape the ground with a bulldozer, you don't realize where they are. And anyone who's built a house in North Georgia has run into that. If a tree happens to grow up on a site where there's a huge slab of rock just a foot or 2 feet underground, that really limits the amount of water that it has available to it in the soil. And once it dries out down to the top of the rock, then the tree's kind of screwed. And one of the things that a serious drought stress situation does for us is identify those sites. That's of almost no consolation to a homeowner that just lost a big important tree in their yard, but that's the case. So you just have to recognize that nothing lives forever, and in any woodlot, if you let things go the way nature would do it, then you're going to start off with an enormous density of trees, and 50 years later, you're going to wind up with about 10 trees per acre. The rest of those trees died. Somewhere along the way, they died. So trees do die even in normal, healthy forest stands. So that's no consolation at all. I haven't helped you with your calls from your clients, I know.
No, that's all right. They need to know trees die.
But you can refer them to me and I'll tell them trees die. You don't have to give them the bad news.
So we're looking at doing I mean, I'm in Forsyth County, which is undergoing just tremendous development and land disturbance. One of the things that we've got a citizen initiative on is a reforestation project. Can you provide us any guidance on that, as you know, as to species that we should select, where we can go to get some assistance? I know that there's Tree City, but we're looking to do county-wide. So what would you recommend on that?
Right. Well, you know, obviously, if you're talking reforestation, then native species are the things to go with. You're probably better off using something that's not a horticultural cultivar. So try to plant the native species of red maple rather than an October Glory or Autumn Blaze or whatever you know, popular landscape cultivar there is. They're just more likely to survive the periods of stress that we're almost certainly going to be going through. And as these weather swings, which seem to be becoming the standard and more extreme, then planting a tree that needs moisture, even just a little ways uphill from where it can reach the moisture in a drought period, is going to be critical to determining whether that tree survives or not. And again, you can't always tell what's under the ground, so you can't always know. But you know, don't plant maples on top of the ridge, and don't plant trees that don't like to have their feet in the water for any extended period of time down in the bottom. Nature will sort it out. You could plant everything everywhere and let nature sort it out, but that's not a very efficient or cost-effective way to go about it.
Thank you. Again, if anyone has questions, you can type them in the chat box, or you can open up your mic and ask questions.
I think you asked about the emerald ash borer earlier. Of course, there's a website that has really good information and updates, but I think virtually the entire of North Georgia is under the quarantine now. So if you have landscapers working in your area, it's less onerous than it was when it was county by county to know where they can trim trees and take the intact branches, as opposed to having to chip them up before they move them out of the county. But that still is a program that's in effect. So you need to be sure that your arborist groups are aware of that and are cognizant of whether the places they're working are in or out of the quarantine area.
I had another question recently from someone asking about the insect-resistant hemlock. Is there such a thing?
There are hemlocks that are more resistant to the hemlock woolly adelgid. Those that are from China, and there are a couple of species over there. But you're sort of in the same situation as we are with chestnuts. You know, we don't have American chestnuts thriving in our forests anymore. Remarkably enough, there are still stumps that are sprouting. You know, more than 100 years since the chestnut blight wiped out all of the mature chestnuts, but they don't survive to the point of reproducing. Chinese chestnuts do, and there are some oriental hemlock varieties that also would do fine, but they're not the native hemlock, and so there's a reluctance to introduce those trees into the area. With chestnuts, they're now trying to breed what are essentially American chestnuts with just enough of the Chinese chestnut that it's resistant to the disease. I think you can do that really easily with genetic engineering, but that's not the way anyone wants to go either. So we're trying to get as close as we can. So far with hemlocks, that effort is pretty early in the process. We have treatments that'll protect hemlocks, but they have to be applied every 3 to 5 years. And they did treat some very large stands in the interior of the Smoky Mountains National Park. just because they wanted some stands that were still intact, more or less as a genetic repository than anything else. So the answer, I guess, the short answer is no, there aren't any insect-resistant strains of our hemlock, and we haven't found any individuals, at this point at least, that have resisted the adelgid and could be used as breeding stock. But that search is very much active and ongoing.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any more questions coming into the text box. So if we don't see anyone typing, I'm going to say thank you and let everyone get back to their day.
All right, thanks, Heather. And don't forget, we do have a forest health specialist down in Tifton in Dr. Elizabeth McCarty now. And she is a resource, particularly for those in South Georgia, that you should take advantage of.
And she will come up and speak for you.
Yep, she will.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hudson. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and y'all have a great Tuesday.
All right.